There is a kind of person who is very good at arriving. They walk into rooms well. They learn the rhythms of new environments quickly. They know how to be warm without being too much, present without being overwhelming, friendly without demanding anything in return. They are, by most social measures, easy to be around. And yet, despite all of this, despite the ease, the warmth, the apparent belonging, something inside them never fully lands. They are always, in some private and exhausting way, performing the role of someone who fits, always scanning, almost imperceptibly, for signs of acceptance or withdrawal, always holding just a small part of themselves back, not from strategy, but from something older and more instinctive, a kind of emotional self-preservation that learned, long ago, that it is safer not to fully arrive, because full arrival means full exposure, and full exposure means the possibility of being asked to leave. This is the experience of feeling like a guest in your own relationships, and it is more common than most people know. It lives not in the dramatic or obvious margins of life, not in isolation or visible loneliness, but in the very center of things, in friendships that look close from the outside, but feel strangely provisional from within, in romantic relationships where love is present and genuine, but the sense of truly belonging, of being irreplaceable rather than replaceable, never quite settles. It shows up in specific, recognizable ways, in the hesitation before sending a message, because some part of the mind asks, will I be bothering them? Am I too much? In the habit of reading between the lines of every interaction, searching for the real meaning beneath the surface words, not out of paranoia, but out of a deeply trained sensitivity to shifts in tone or energy, in the way a slightly cooler response, a delayed reply, a distracted glance can unravel an entire sense of security in minutes. It shows up in the tendency to give more than is asked for, to be available at inconvenient hours, to suppress personal needs, to preserve the comfort of others, to shrink, quietly and consistently, whenever personal preferences might create conflict, because conflict feels like threat, and threat feels like proximity to the door. It shows up in the exhaustion that follows social interactions that looked, to everyone else, perfectly enjoyable. Because performing belonging, even well, even convincingly, costs something. The energy of constant monitoring, constant adjustment, constant fine-tuning of the self to match what the environment seems to need is enormous, and it goes largely unseen, even by the people closest to them. Because the performance is too good, the person who feels like a guest has usually had a lot of practice at looking like they belong. They have refined the art of being accepted over many years, in many rooms, in many relationships. And the art is real, the warmth is genuine, the connection is not false, but underneath it, quietly and persistently, runs the conviction that the acceptance is conditional, that it is contingent on continued performance, that the moment they stop being easy, or agreeable, or available, or useful, the invitation will expire. This is the deepest expression of this wound, not the loneliness itself, but the belief that the loneliness is earned. That belonging is something to be maintained through effort, not something to simply be received by virtue of existing. And so they never stop working for it, they never fully unpack, they never allow themselves the full, unguarded weight of being here, with all the messiness and need and imperfection that genuine belonging requires. They remain, always, slightly ready to leave before they are asked to. This is not a personality type. It is a response. A learned, once necessary, now limiting response to something that happened much earlier than the relationships they currently inhabit. And it deserves, at last, to be seen clearly. Where the distance was first learned. The feeling of being a permanent guest does not begin in adulthood. It begins in the first rooms a person ever inhabited, the first relationships that taught them what belonging felt like, and, more significantly, what it cost. For many people who carry this pattern, early belonging was conditional, not in an explicit, stated way. Rarely did anyone say, "You are only welcome here if you behave correctly." But the conditions were present, communicated in subtler and more pervasive ways, in the emotional temperature of the home that shifted depending on mood or behavior, in the love that felt abundant when the child was agreeable and somehow cooler, more distant, when they were difficult or needy or simply themselves in ways that were inconvenient. A child in this environment learns something foundational. They learn that belonging is not a given, it is a status, and like all statuses, it can be lost. This lesson does not require dramatic experiences to take root. It grows in ordinary soil. In the parent whose approval was inconsistent, warm one day, withdrawn the next, with no clear pattern the child could identify, and therefore no reliable way to feel safe. In the family system where one child's needs consistently outweighed another's, leaving the quieter one to conclude that their presence mattered less. In the household where emotional expression was permitted only in certain forms, where happiness was welcome but sadness was not, where confidence was praised but vulnerability was met with discomfort or dismissal. In each of these environments, the child makes a calculation, not consciously, not with words, but with the body, with the adaptive intelligence that children possess in extraordinary measure. The calculation goes something like this. The way I naturally am is not quite right for this space. If I adjust, if I become more agreeable, more useful, more attuned to what others need, and less focused on what I need, I will be safer here. And so the adjusting begins. For some children, the origins are in environments of more explicit instability. Homes where belonging was regularly threatened, through conflict, through unpredictable emotional responses, through the experience of being emotionally shut out as punishment. When a child learns that love is something that can be withheld, that the people who are supposed to be the most permanent, the most unconditional in their acceptance, can and do withdraw, the impact on their relational template is profound. They learn that no belonging is truly permanent, that every sense of acceptance contains, somewhere inside it, the seed of its own potential withdrawal. There are also the social roots, the classroom, the peer group, the early friendship that ended without explanation, the exclusion that seemed arbitrary but landed with the full force of a verdict. Children who experience significant social rejection in formative years often carry a particular flavor of this wound, one marked by hypervigilance to group dynamics, an acute sensitivity to shifts in social inclusion, and a learned tendency to preemptively manage their presentation to minimize the risk of being left out again. And then there is the more diffuse, cultural origin, the families and communities in which love was real but demonstrative belonging was never explicitly expressed, where the child was cared for but never quite told, in felt and embodied ways, that their presence was a gift, that the room was better for them being in it, that they were not just tolerated but genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably wanted. The absence of that message, even in a loving home, leaves a particular kind of gap. A person who grew up never hearing, in words or gesture or consistent emotional presence, "You belong here, simply as you are," will spend years walking into rooms and relationships wondering if this is finally the place where that will be true. They keep arriving, they keep unpacking just enough to stay comfortable, but they never let themselves fully settle, because they never learned that settling was allowed. The psychology of provisional belonging psychology has a precise name for what drives this pattern. It lives at the intersection of attachment theory and a less widely known but critically important concept, the fawn response. Together, they describe both the relational blueprint that creates the feeling of being a permanent guest and the behavioral strategies that develop to manage that feeling. Attachment theory, established by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth through her landmark Strange Situation studies, identifies the core patterns through which people learn to relate to others based on early caregiving experiences. Of particular relevance here is what Ainsworth called anxious preoccupied attachment, a pattern that develops when early caregiving was inconsistent, sometimes warm and available, sometimes distant or unresponsive, unpredictably present. Children in this environment cannot form a stable internal model of relationships as safe and reliable. Instead, they develop a chronic anxiety about connection, a hyperactivation of the attachment system that keeps them in a state of constant monitoring. Are they still there? Am I still wanted? What does this shift in tone mean? This hypervigilance does not disappear in adulthood. It simply moves into adult relationships and continues its work. The anxiously attached adult does not feel secure in belonging. They feel, always, that belonging must be earned, maintained, and vigilantly protected, because at a nervous system level, they have never experienced it as unconditional. The fawn response adds another critical layer. First described by trauma therapist Pete Walker, the fawn response is a survival strategy alongside fight, flight, and freeze that develops in environments where placating others was the safest available option, where the child learned that the most reliable way to prevent rejection or emotional withdrawal was to become maximally attuned to what others needed and to provide it, at the cost of their own needs, boundaries, and authentic self-expression. The fawn response produces people who are extraordinarily good at reading emotional environments, who anticipate needs before they are expressed, who smooth over conflict, absorb others' discomfort, and shape themselves, with impressive flexibility, to whatever the relationship appears to require. From the outside, they appear selfless, easygoing, accommodating. From the inside, they are exhausted and lonely in a very specific way, the loneliness of being well-liked but poorly known. Neuroscience offers a third dimension to this picture. Research using neuroimaging has demonstrated that social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region of the brain central to processing physical discomfort, lights up in response to social rejection in ways that are neurologically indistinguishable from bodily hurt. This is not metaphor. Social belonging is, at a biological level, a survival need. The threat of exclusion registers in the body as danger. For someone with a history of conditional belonging, this neural alarm system is chronically sensitized. It fires at low-level social signals, a tone of voice, a slight withdrawal of warmth, a friend who seems distracted, that others might not even register. The body is always running a quiet threat assessment, always asking, am I still safe here? Am I still wanted? This is not anxiety in the casual sense. It is a nervous system doing precisely what it was trained to do, protecting against the loss of belonging, which it learned, long ago, was never guaranteed. Psychologist Susan Anderson, whose work on abandonment and social rejection has been widely studied, describes this hypervigilance as an emotional imprint, a deeply encoded pattern of expectation that shapes perception, reaction, and relational behavior outside of conscious awareness. It is not something a person chooses. It is something they inherited from an emotional environment that taught them, convincingly and repeatedly, that their place in any relational world was always provisional. Understanding this is not about adding clinical labels to human experience. It is about compassion, about recognizing that what looks like insecurity, neediness, or emotional fragility is, at its root, intelligence. An adaptive, once necessary intelligence that is simply operating in a context where the original threat no longer exists, but where the nervous system hasn't yet received that news. The performance of fitting in there is an enormous amount of labor involved in always being a guest, labor that is mostly invisible, labor that happens in the seconds before a response is given, in the rapid, subconscious calculation of what answer will land best. What version of the self will be most welcome here? What edge of authentic feeling should be smoothed down before it surfaces and risks making the room uncomfortable? This is the performance of fitting in, and for those who have practiced it since childhood, it has become so natural, so thoroughly integrated into daily behavior, that it barely registers as a performance anymore. It feels, from the inside, simply like being considerate, like being adaptable, like being emotionally intelligent. But underneath the fluency of the performance is a conflict that never fully quiets, because there is a self that exists beneath the adjusted, softened, carefully managed presentation. A self with opinions that might cause friction, with needs that might inconvenience, with grief, frustration, or desire that does not fit neatly into the role of easy guest. And that self does not simply disappear because it is not being shown. It waits. It accumulates. It expresses itself in the exhaustion that arrives after social interactions, in the resentment that flickers, briefly and guiltily, when the effort of self-erasure is not acknowledged, in the longing, deep, specific, sometimes unbearable, to be known rather than simply liked. This is the central conflict of provisional belonging, the war between the hunger for genuine connection and the terror of what genuine connection requires, which is genuine exposure. Being truly known means being truly seen, and being truly seen means the possibility of being truly rejected. Not the performance, but the actual self. And that risk, for someone whose nervous system learned that belonging is conditional, can feel unsurvivable. And so the performance continues. It continues in the relationship where everything looks harmonious, because one person has quietly erased every preference that might create tension. It continues in the friendship, where depth is always available for the other person, but carefully withheld for oneself. It continues in the way disagreement feels like betrayal, not because conflict is actually dangerous, but because the body remembers a time when it was. There is a particular grief inside this conflict, the grief of being surrounded by people who care for the version of you they know, and knowing with quiet certainty that they don't fully know you, not because they haven't tried, but because you haven't let them. Because letting them would mean trusting that what they find, when the performance softens, will still be enough. And that trust has never felt safe to extend. This is the resistance to healing that lives inside this wound. It is not stubbornness. It is not self-sabotage in any simple sense. It is the completely understandable reluctance to dismantle a system that has, for a very long time, kept a person safe, even if that safety has come at the cost of genuine belonging. The performance kept the invitations coming. It kept the rooms available. It kept the loss of belonging at a distance, but it also kept the self at a distance. From others, yes, but most painfully from its own fullness. From the experience of inhabiting a relationship without the low hum of vigilance, without the quiet work of maintenance, without the breath half held in preparation for the moment the welcome runs out. The exhaustion of this, accumulated over years, is real. And it is often what eventually creates the crack. The moment when the performance becomes too costly to sustain, and the question beneath it finally surfaces. What would happen if I just stayed? As I am, without the adjustments, without the managing, would I still be welcome? That question, terrifying as it is also the beginning of something. The moment you stop shrinking it often begins with a small act of honesty, not a grand declaration, not a confrontation or a breakdown or a dramatic unraveling, something quieter. A moment when the automatic adjustment, the smoothing, the shrinking, the shaping of self to fit, pauses just long enough for something true to surface. Maybe it is a preference finally stated, tentatively, in a relationship where preferences were always suppressed. Maybe it is a boundary drawn, imperfectly, where before there were none. Maybe it is the simple act of noticing, in real time, with the strange clarity that sometimes arrives unbidden, I am doing it again. I am making myself smaller so there is less of me to reject, and noticing, this time, is enough to pause. This is the turning point, not the resolution, but the moment of honest seeing. The moment when the pattern becomes visible enough to name, and naming it creates, for the first time, a small but real distance between the person and the behavior, the space in which a different choice becomes possible. For many people, this moment is accompanied by a particular kind of grief, because to see the pattern clearly is to understand its cost, not abstractly, but specifically. The relationships where the full self was never brought, the friendships that stayed comfortable because they were never allowed to go deep, the romantic partnerships where love was real but true intimacy, the messy, unperformed, mutually vulnerable kind, was always kept just slightly out of reach. The grief is for all of that unlived depth, for the version of connection that was longed for and simultaneously kept at a safe distance, for so long, in so many rooms. There is also, in this turning point, a reckoning with identity. Because when a person has spent years adjusting themselves to fit their environments, a genuine question emerges. Who am I, actually, beneath the adjustments? What are the opinions, the preferences, the edges and textures of self that were consistently smoothed away? What does the unperformed version of this person look, sound, and feel like? This can be disorienting. The self that emerges when the performance softens is not always immediately comfortable, not for the person themselves, and sometimes not for the people around them who are accustomed to the easier, more accommodating version. There is a period of awkwardness, of not quite knowing how to be authentic when authenticity was suppressed for so long, of testing, tentatively, what is actually safe to express. But here is what this turning point tends to reveal, slowly and with increasing clarity. Most of the feared rejections do not come. The people who genuinely care, and there are usually more of them than the hypervigilant mind believed, do not withdraw when the performance softens. They lean in. They respond to honesty with honesty. They offer the very thing that was most feared to ask for: acceptance of the actual self, not the managed version. And this revelation, when it comes, is both relief and devastation in equal measure. Relief, because the belonging that was sought is actually available. Devastation, because it was available perhaps all along, and so much energy was spent preparing for a withdrawal that in many cases was never coming. Psychologist Harriet Lerner writes that the greatest risk most people take in relationships is not conflict or vulnerability. It is the risk of being truly known, because being truly known removes all the management, all the performance, all the careful construction of an acceptable self, and leaves only the person, simply, fully, undeniably, themselves. That nakedness is terrifying, and it is also the only path to the belonging that was always being sought. The moment of stopping the shrinking is not a single event. It is a practice that is begun, forgotten, begun again, a direction more than a destination. But once begun, once the first honest word is spoken, the first real need expressed, the first moment of imperfect, unmanaged self allowed to be present in a relationship, something shifts that cannot fully unshift. A door opens, and the light on the other side of it is the genuine belonging that was always, underneath everything, what the heart was reaching for. Belonging as a practice, not a prize. The old belief goes something like this: belonging is something that is granted by others, by the room, by the relationship. It is an outcome, a verdict, something bestowed upon those who have earned it through sufficient agreeableness, usefulness, or careful self-presentation. This belief feels true for those who carry it in a way that is difficult to argue with, because it was, once, functionally accurate. In the environments where it was formed, belonging was conditional. It was something that could be lost through wrong behavior or inconvenient authenticity. But it is not the permanent truth about belonging, and the shift at the center of healing, the one that changes the experience of relationships more than any other single thing, is the gradual experiential discovery that belonging is not a prize to be won. It is a practice to be cultivated from the inside. What this means, concretely, is that the sense of belonging in any relationship is not located solely in the other person's acceptance. It is located, significantly, in one's own willingness to be present, to show up as a genuine participant rather than a careful visitor, to bring the actual self, opinions, needs, imperfections, and all, into the relational space and allow it to be received. This is not a passive shift. It is an active, practiced reorientation. It begins with what might be called self-authorization, the internal act of deciding that one's presence in a relationship is not provisional. That one belongs there not because of performance or usefulness, but because genuine relationships are built on mutual presence, and one's presence is valuable. This feels almost absurdly simple to state, and profoundly difficult to embody, for someone whose nervous system spent years learning the opposite. It requires practice in the small moments, in letting a difference of opinion exist without immediately softening it into nothing, in expressing a need, "I'd actually prefer this, if that's okay," and tolerating the momentary vulnerability of having asked, in staying in the conversation when it becomes slightly uncomfortable, rather than redirecting toward whatever will restore easiness fastest. Each of these small moments is, neurologically, a new data point. It tells the nervous system something it has not been told enough. The relationship survived honesty. Belonging did not collapse when the real self appeared. It is safe, here, to stay. Over time, with repetition, the nervous system begins to update its model. Not all at once, not without backsliding, but genuinely, measurably, in ways that change the felt experience of being in relationship. Therapeutic approaches that are particularly effective for this pattern include internal family systems work, which treats the fawn response not as a flaw to eliminate, but as a protective part of the self that can be understood, appreciated for its function, and gradually released from a role it no longer needs to play. And somatic work, which addresses the patterns at the body level, in breath, in posture, in the physical signature of self-erasure, and teaches the nervous system, through embodied experience, what it feels like to take up space without apology. Community also heals this wound in ways that individual work cannot fully replicate. Finding spaces, whether in friendship, in creative community, in therapy groups, or elsewhere, where authentic presence is not just tolerated, but actively welcomed, where the expression of a genuine self is met with warmth rather than discomfort. Each such experience becomes evidence against the old story. Each moment of being genuinely received rewrites, slightly, the script that said belonging required performance. Foundational practice of belonging to oneself first, of becoming, in one's own inner life, a reliable and accepting presence, of treating the self with the same patient welcome one would extend to a cherished friend, not despite the imperfections, but without the constant apology for them, because a person who belongs to themselves, who has built an interior home that does not require external validation to feel solid, moves through relationships differently, not with walls but with ground, not with less need for connection, but with less desperation in the reaching. They can be in a room, genuinely in it, without the constant background monitoring of whether the invitation still stands. They have, at last, stopped waiting to be asked to leave. You were always allowed to stay somewhere along the way. A story was absorbed, not spoken aloud, not chosen deliberately, but absorbed. From inconsistent warmth, from conditional acceptance, from the accumulated experience of a self that felt more welcome in some configurations than in others. The story said, "Your belonging here is not certain. It must be maintained. Watch carefully, adjust accordingly. Do not ask for too much." And for a long time, perhaps a very long time, that story organized everything. It organized how rooms were entered and how deeply they were inhabited. It organized which parts of the self were brought forward and which were kept in reserve. It organized the careful, exhausting, quietly heroic labor of being present without being fully present, of connecting without fully committing to the connection, of loving people while always, somewhere beneath the love, preparing for the loss of them. It is a story that deserves enormous compassion, because it was not born of weakness. It was born of wisdom, the early wisdom of a person who learned their environment accurately and adapted to it with extraordinary intelligence. The problem is not that the story was wrong once. The problem is only that it is still being told, in rooms and relationships where the conditions that created it no longer apply. And stories can be rewritten, not erased. The past does not disappear, and the pattern does not vanish overnight. But the story's authority over the present can be gently, persistently questioned. Every time a genuine opinion is offered, every time a need is expressed and received, every time the performance softens, just slightly, and the actual person beneath it is allowed to be in the room, and the room does not end. These moments accumulate. They become a counter-narrative, a growing body of evidence against the old story. Not proof that belonging is guaranteed, nothing in the human world is guaranteed, but proof that it does not require the performance to exist, that it can be real and mutual and freely given by people who actually see you. There is something worth saying, directly and without softening, to anyone who has spent years feeling like a guest in their own relationships. You are always allowed to stay, not the adjusted version, not the agreeable, available, carefully managed version. The actual version, uncertain and opinionated and sometimes difficult and deeply feeling and fully, irreducibly human. That person was always welcome. The rooms that were worth staying in, the relationships that were built on something genuine, those rooms had space for that person all along. The tragedy is not that the belonging was unavailable. The tragedy is that it was approached from behind a wall of self-protection that made it impossible to receive. And that wall was built for good reason. It deserves honoring, not shame, but it has stood long enough. The work now, slow, uneven, ongoing, is the work of letting the wall become a door, of learning, in relationship after relationship, that the self does not need to be managed into acceptability before it is allowed to enter. That presence, full, honest, imperfect presence, is not the risk, it is the offering, the thing that actually creates the belonging that was always being sought. There is a particular kind of peace that becomes available to people who have done enough of this work, not the peace of no longer feeling the old pull, the reflex toward adjustment, the monitoring, the readiness to shrink. Those threads remain, woven into the fabric, but they become less loud, less authoritative, less capable of running the whole story. What grows in their place is quieter and steadier, a sense of being, in the rooms one inhabits, genuinely there, not performing arrival but actually arriving, not waiting to be given permission to belong, but simply, steadily belonging. To the people in one's life, to the relationships built with honesty and care, and most importantly, most foundationally, to oneself. You are not a guest here. You never were. Come in, sit down, unpack. You are allowed to stay. The door was open all along. You only needed to stop apologizing for walking through it.